I nursed my mother for 4 years. At the funeral, I found out my siblings had convinced her I was stealing from her. At the wake in my mother's front room, holding a cup of tea I did not want, my aunt took my arm and said, kindly, meaning to comfort me, "You mustn't take it to heart, love. She wasn't herself at the end. All that business about the money." And I said, "What business about the money?" And my aunt's face did something I will remember until I die. A sort of collapse and then a scramble and then, oh, Geraldine, I thought you knew. I had nursed my mother for 4 years and 2 months. I had given up a job, moved into her house, learned to manage a syringe driver, washed her, dressed her, sat with her through 3 hospital admissions and one night in A&E that lasted 11 hours. I had held her hand while she died on the 18th of January at 20 past 4 in the morning. And at her wake, from an aunt who assumed I already knew, I found out that for the last 2.5 years of her life, my mother had believed I was stealing from her. Not suspected, believed, had said so to people, had been frightened of it. And this is the sentence that has taken 2 years and a great deal of help to survive, had, according to my aunt, cried about it. My mother spent the end of her life frightened of the person who was washing her. Let me back up. My name is Geraldine Okonkwo Baptiste. I'm 49 years old, and this is not a story about money, which is the thing that makes it different from most of the stories I've read since. There was money involved, there always is, but I need to say at the outset that I got the money back, easily, within about 4 months, because the accusation was false and provably so, and an audit sorted it. And it changed nothing at all. Because you cannot audit 4 years of a dying woman's fear. There is no forensic accountant who can go back and unfright my mother. What was actually taken from me was not an inheritance. It was the last 4 years of my mother's life, which I spent believing we were close, believing she trusted me, believing that the thing I was doing was received as love, and which she spent, at least partly, wondering whether her daughter was robbing her. I did not lose money. I lost the meaning of 4 years, retrospectively, in one sentence at a wake. Let me tell you about my family, and I'll be brief, because the shape is one you'll recognize instantly. There were 3 of us. My brother Marcus, 2 years older, who lives in Kent and works in something to do with logistics. My sister Yvette, 4 years younger, who lives 20 minutes from our mother's house and has always been, in her own description, very close to Mom. And me, in the middle, who was living in Bristol with a job I liked in local authority commissioning, and who came back. My mother, Cecile, was diagnosed in the autumn of 2019. Motor neuron disease, which for those who haven't been near it is a diagnosis that tells you exactly what is coming and gives you no way to stop it. And there was a family conversation, of the sort that happens in every family, about what would happen. And what happened was what always happens. Everybody agreed something must be done, and then everybody looked at the person who could. Marcus had a job and 2 teenagers in Kent. Vet had a job locally, and this was stated as a fact requiring no examination. Couldn't do the personal care side, I'm just not built for it. And I was divorced, childless, and my mother's daughter. So in March 2020, and yes, that was the month, which added its own texture, I let my flat in Bristol, took a career break that became a resignation, and moved into my mother's house in Luton with 2 suitcases. I did that willingly. I want that stated plainly, because later it was suggested I had been trapped or resentful, and I was neither. I would do it again. She was my mother, she was dying, and I was the one who could. Let me tell you what 4 years of that actually is, because she cared for her mother is a phrase that flattens the entire thing. The first year was manageable and terrible in a specific way, the way where the person is still themselves and knows exactly what's coming, and you both have to pretend to be normal over breakfast. She could still walk that year with a frame. She could still talk clearly. We watched a great deal of television and had, I think, the best conversations of our entire relationship. The second year was when it became physical. Transfers bed to chair to commode, which are a skill, and which I learned from a district nurse in about 40 minutes and then performed perhaps 4,000 times. The peg feed, the suction. The night waking, which by the end of that year was 3 or 4 times, every night indefinitely. I did not sleep properly for 2 years and 8 months. I want to put that specifically, because there's a thing that happens to a person's judgment and emotional regulation under that kind of sustained sleep deprivation, and it becomes relevant to what my siblings later said about me. The third year was the speech. That was the hardest of all of it, and I would not have predicted that. My mother, who was a very funny woman, sharp, a talker, the person who ran every conversation in every room she was ever in, lost her speech across about 9 months. First slurring, then a few words at a time, then a communication board, then I gaze on a tablet that never worked properly and made her furious. That is the part I would tell anyone facing this. It is not the dying that breaks you. It's the losing them in installments, while they're still there, watching you lose them. Let me give you 4 specific mornings, because I have described 4 years in 5 paragraphs, and that is exactly the compression that let my sister say I'd been living there. Morning in year 1. My mother, still able to walk with the frame, insisting on making me a cup of tea. It took her 11 minutes, and she spilled most of it, and I sat at the table and let her, because refusing would have taken something from her that neither of us could name. She put it down in front of me, about 1/3 of a cup cold, and said, "There, I'm not useless yet." I drank it. A morning in year 2, the first time I had to clean her properly after an accident in the night. She was 71 years old and she cried, and not from distress at the mess, she said when she could. "I changed your nappies and now look." And I said, "That's exactly right, Mum, that's how it's meant to go." And I kept my voice completely level, and I went and stood in the garden for 4 minutes afterwards. Morning in year 3, she had stopped being able to speak clearly and was using the board, and she spelled out, letter by letter, over about 2 minutes, a joke. An actual joke about the physiotherapist's shoes. It took her 2 minutes to deliver a punchline. And it was funny. It was genuinely funny. It was my mother's exact sense of humor arriving through a plastic alphabet, and we both laughed, and she was pleased with herself for the rest of the day. And a morning in year 4. Near the end, she could not do the board anymore, and the eye gaze was not working, and she was trying to tell me something, and could not, and after about 10 minutes of failing, she simply stopped and looked at me, and I said, "I know, Mom." And she blinked twice, which was yes. And I still do not know what she was trying to say. It might have been about the money. I have thought about that a great deal. That is what she cared for her mother means, not a summary. 4,000 mornings, most of them ordinary, several of them the worst thing that has ever happened to either of us, all of them mine. Fourth year was hospital beds in the front room, and a rota of agency carers 3 mornings a week, funded, eventually, by continuing healthcare and me the rest of the time. And the 18th of January at 4:20. Now let me tell you about the money, because this is where the machine was built, and it was built out of entirely ordinary things. When I moved in, I took over managing my mother's finances, not by seizing anything, by necessity. She could still manage in 2020, but she was already finding the online banking difficult, and by the end of that year, she couldn't hold a pen reliably enough to sign a check. So we did what people do. We went to the bank together in the autumn of 2020. While she was still entirely capable, and we set up a joint account and put me on it, and she signed a power of attorney with a solicitor. A proper one registered with a capacity assessment, all of it correct. I want to note that Yvette was told about this at the time and raised no objection whatsoever. And from then on, I ran her money. Her pension came in. Her bills went out. Her shopping was bought on that account. And her care costs, the enormous quantity of things that a dying person needs, which nobody warns you about, came out of it too. Let me list some of them, because this becomes the entire substance of the accusation later. A riser recliner chair, £940. Second-hand car, because her old one was useless for a wheelchair, and I needed to be able to transport her. £3,200, bought in my name because I was the one insured to drive it, out of her money, because it was for her. Wet room conversion, because she could no longer get in a bath, £11,000. Repairs to a boiler and a roof, because the house she was dying in was falling apart, and it seemed reasonable that the money maintain the house. And 100 smaller things. Pads. Bedding constantly, special cutlery, a pressure mattress the NHS wouldn't fund, taxis, a carer's mileage, food for me because I lived there and ate there and had no income of my own. And there's the seed, right there in that last sentence, and I could not see it for 4 years, because I had no income. I had given up my job. And so my food, my petrol, my phone bill, and eventually simply the money I lived on came out of my mother's account, with her knowledge and in 2020 her explicit agreement. She said, and I can hear her saying it, "You're not to be out of pocket for this, Jerry." But there was no arrangement, nothing written. No agreed figure, no carer's allowance formally structured, no note anywhere saying Geraldine draws £400 a month for living expenses, agreed by Cecile. There was just a joint account, out of which a dying woman's daughter paid for a dying woman's life and her own life at the same time, for 4 years, with no documentation and no separation. I want to explain why nobody set up anything better, because why didn't you formalize it is the question everybody asks, and the answer is the answer to the whole story. The proper thing, I know this now, I have been told it a dozen times since, would have been a written care agreement. Document signed while my mother had capacity, recording that I would provide her care, that I would give up my income to do it, and that in exchange I would draw an agreed sum from her account each month at a stated figure for my living costs. That document would have taken a solicitor an hour and would have made the entire subsequent nightmare impossible. We did not make it, and here is why, and it is the same reason it never gets made. Sit my mother down, in 2020, newly diagnosed with a terminal illness, and say to her, "Before I give up my life to look after you, I'd like us to sign an agreement about what I'll be paid," was unthinkable. It felt like turning her death into a transaction at the exact moment she needed it to be love. She would have signed it, I think, without hesitation. She was practical. But I could not bring myself to ask, because asking would have said, "I am doing this for terms." And I was not doing it for terms. I was doing it because she was my mother. So the very thing that would have protected me, a cold, clear, business-like document, was the thing my love for her made me unable to create. And my sister's entire campaign was possible only in the gap where that document should have been. That is the cruelty of it, and it is a cruelty built into the situation itself. People most likely to be accused of profiting from care are the people who refused, out of love, to make it a contract. And the people who would happily have signed the contract are, very often, exactly the people who never do the caring. And when somebody later looked at that account and wanted to see theft, there it was. Hundreds of payments to Geraldine, Geraldine's card, Geraldine's phone, a car in Geraldine's name. I want to describe the things I noticed at the time and misread, because this is the part that still keeps me awake. Around the middle of year 2, my mother started asking me about money in a way she hadn't before. Not accusingly, anxiously. She'd say, "Is there enough?" And I'd say, "Yes, Mum, there's plenty," and show her. And she'd nod and be reassured and then ask again a fortnight later. I put that down to the illness. Anxiety is extremely common in that diagnosis, and she was on medication partly for it. So when my mother repeatedly, over months, sought reassurance about her money, I read it as her illness, and I was gentle with her about it, and I never once asked, "Why has she started worrying about this now?" In year 3, twice, she asked me directly about specific things. Once about the car. "Whose car is it, Jerry?" And I explained again that it was hers really, bought with her money in my name for the insurance. And she said, "But if I die, is it yours?" And I said, "Honestly, I suppose technically it is." And she looked away. She looked away. My mother, who could barely move her head by then, turned her face away from me, and I read it as tiredness, and in year 3 there was the solicitor. Letter arrived, addressed to my mother, from a firm in town, not her usual solicitor, the one who'd done the power of attorney, asking her to confirm an appointment she had apparently requested about a review of your affairs. I asked her about it. She was distressed by the question and could not, by then, easily explain herself, and she used the board to spell something I could not follow, and then gave up and closed her eyes. I rang the firm and they said, quite properly, that they could not discuss anything with me. And I let it go because I had a woman with motor neuron disease to look after, and I did not have the resources to pursue a mystery. That appointment, I later learned, had been made for her by my sister. My mother died on the 18th of January at 4:20 in the morning, and I was holding her hand, and Yvette arrived at 7 and Marcus at about 11. 11 days later at the wake, my Aunt Beryl said the thing about the money. I want to describe the next hour because it was the strangest hour of my life. I did not scream or make a scene. Put my cup down and I went upstairs to my mother's bedroom, which I had slept in for 4 years, and I sat on the bed, and I made myself take my aunt's sentence apart word by word. All that business about the money, which implied a known thing. A thing that had a history, a thing that had been discussed by people at a level of familiarity that produced the phrase, all that business. She wasn't herself at the end. Which implied that the accusation was understood as a symptom, meaning it had been noticed and explained away and therefore lived with. I thought you knew, which was the worst of them, because it meant enough people knew that my aunt could reasonably assume I was among them. And I sat on that bed and understood that there had been, running alongside my 4 years, a second story about those 4 years that I had not been in. And then I did the thing that I would warn anybody against and that I could not possibly have avoided, which is that I went back through all 4 years, in my head, looking for it. It took about 3 weeks, and it was the closest I have come to losing my mind. Because once you know there was a second story, every memory you own becomes evidence in a case you cannot try. The night she asked, "Is there enough?" Was that the illness, or had Yvette been that afternoon? The day she turned her face away when I explained the car. I had read that as fatigue for 2 years, and now it would not say read that way. There was a fortnight in the autumn of year 3 when she was cold with me, actually cold, and I had put it down to change in her medication, and now I could not stop asking what had happened in that fortnight. I could not check any of it. That's what makes it a form of madness. Every single person who could have told me what my mother was feeling on a given Tuesday in 2022 was either dead or lying to me. And I started to reinterpret my own behavior too, which was worse. I remembered being brisk with her about the bank statements once. "Mum, we've been through this, look, I'll show you again," because I was tired and it was the 4th time that month. At the time it was nothing, a daughter being slightly short with her mother. In the new light, it was a woman deflecting scrutiny. I had to sit with the fact that some of my ordinary exhausted impatience, over 4 years, must have looked to a frightened woman exactly like guilt. I could not prove I hadn't looked guilty. I have never been able to prove that. It is the one part of this that the notebook did not fix. I got the shape of it out of my aunt over the following week, in a series of very uncomfortable phone calls in which she plainly wished she'd never spoken. It had started, as far as she could tell, in year 2, and it had come from Yvette. Not as an accusation, never as an accusation, that's what made it survivable for 2.5 years. It came as concern. Yvette would visit our mother, sit with her, and be worried about her. And her worry took a very particular form, which was questions. "Do you know what's happening with your money, Mum? Has Jerry shown you the statements recently? It's just that's a lot for a chair, isn't it? Did you agree to that? Whose name is the car in, Mum? Do you know, I'm not saying anything, I'm sure it's fine. I just think you should know what's going on in your own account. That is the entire mechanism. Not one false statement of fact. Not one accusation that could be denied or disproved. Just a sustained program of questions, delivered by a loving daughter to a frightened dying woman who could not check anything herself, could not walk to bank, could not read a statement without help, and by year 3 could not speak. And the questions did what questions do. They constructed a suspicion my mother could neither confirm nor dismiss, and left her alone with it, in a bed, dependent for every physical need on the person she was being invited to suspect. I keep thinking about that. She was being encouraged to fear the person who was doing her personal care. She could not have got away from me if she'd wanted to. She could not have told anyone without going through me. My sister put a suspicion into a woman who was completely, physically, hourly dependent on the suspect, and then went home. Let me be fair, because I have spent 2 years trying to be, and because the fair version is worse. I do not think Yvette set out to make our mother die frightened. I think, and this is my honest assessment, I think Yvette was jealous, because here is what happened in those 4 years that nobody expected. My mother and I became close. Genuinely, properly close, in a way we had never been in my adult life. Yvette had always been the close one. That was the family structure. Yvette lived nearby and rang every Sunday and was the daughter our mother talked about. Then I moved in, and I did 4,000 transfers and 2,000 nights. And by the end of year 1, my mother and I had the relationship that Yvette had always had the title of. And Yvette came round on a Sunday and found the two of us mid-conversation about something and was, in the family's phrase, on the outside of it. I think the questions started there. I think they started as a way of establishing that Yvette was the one really looking out for Mum. The one with the clear head, who wasn't taken in, who was asking the sensible questions nobody else was asking. And I think that once she had said the first few, she could not stop, because stopping would have meant they'd been unjustified. That's my honest view. It was not a plot to steal an inheritance. It was a much smaller, much more human, much more destructive thing. A woman making herself important in her mother's last years by being the one who worried about her, which does not make it better. Because whatever the motive, the effect was that my mother spent the end of her life in a state of low, unresolvable fear about her own daughter, and then died in that state, and I found out at the wake. 3 weeks after the funeral, I confronted them. Both of them at my mother's house, which we were beginning to clear. I did it badly. I want to be honest about that. I had not slept properly in 3 years, I had just lost my mother, and I had spent 21 days holding this thing on my own. I was not calm and I did not present evidence, because I did not have any. I had my aunt's sentence and 3 weeks of reconstruction, and I said, I know what you've been saying to her. I know you told her I was stealing, and here's what happened, and I have thought about it a great deal. Yvette did not deny it. She reframed it instantly in a way that suggested she'd had the answer ready for years. She said, I never once accused you of anything. Not once. You go and find one person who says I accused you of anything. Which was true, and which I could not counter because it was precisely, technically true. And then she said, I asked Mum if she knew what was happening with her own money. Because she was a grown woman with her own bank account, and she had a right to know. And if you think a daughter asking her mother whether she's seen her own statements is slander, Jerry, then I'd ask you why that's such a frightening question. Why is that such a frightening question? And Marcus, who had been in Kent for 4 years and had no idea about anything, said the thing that ended the conversation, and that took me a further 6 months to recover from. He said, Jerry, you're exhausted and you're grieving and you're not making sense. Mum's been dead 3 weeks and you're in her house accusing your sister of a conspiracy. Can you hear yourself? Look at the state of you. You need to sleep and see a doctor before you say something you can't take back. Look at the state of you, and I was, objectively, in a state. I had lost about 2 stone. I hadn't slept. I was crying most days. Every observable fact about my condition supported his interpretation, and the reason for every one of those facts was 4 years of caring for our mother, which he had not done. The very thing that proved my devotion was used as evidence of my instability. I was too wrecked by the caring to be a credible witness about the caring. I left that house and did not speak to either of them for 4 months. In the April, the estate came to be dealt with, and Yvette, through a solicitor now, which told me everything about how prepared she'd been, requested a full account of my mother's finances under the power of attorney, and I welcomed it. I genuinely did. I remember the relief, because I had done nothing wrong, and an accountant would show that, and then it would be over and they'd have to admit it. So I paid for it myself. £4,500 I did not have, and I gave a forensic accountant complete access to 4 years of accounts, and I answered every question, and it took 11 weeks, and it cleared me completely. Every significant expenditure was accounted for and attributable to my mother's care or her property. The car was traced, valued, and voluntarily brought into the estate by me. The wet room was evidence with invoices. Living expenses, the thing that could have sunk me, were quantified at an average of £380 a month, which the accountant noted in his report was substantially below any reasonable market rate for the care provided and below the level of care's allowance, plus the care component the deceased was assessed as requiring. In other words, not only had I not stolen from my mother, I had been living on less than the state would have paid a stranger to do a fraction of what I did. I sent that report to Yvette and Marcus, and I waited for it to be over. It changed nothing. Nothing at all. Yvette's response, through her solicitor, was 2 sentences long. It noted the report's conclusions, and it said that her concerns had always been about transparency rather than any allegation of impropriety, and that she was glad the position is now clear. My concerns were always about transparency. That was the moment I understood the actual shape of what had been done to me, and it took the audit to reveal it, because the accusation had never been Geraldine is a thief. It had been, does anybody actually know what Geraldine is doing? And that is a question that cannot be disproved by an audit, because once the audit comes back clean, the answer is simply, well, now we do. The questioning is retrospectively justified by its own answer. I had spent £4,500 and 11 weeks proving my innocence of a charge that had never formally been laid, and my sister was able to greet the proof as a vindication of her own vigilance. And meanwhile, the thing I actually cared about, that my mother had died frightened, was untouched by the audit. Completely untouched. The report proved I hadn't taken the money. It could not prove what my mother had believed or reach back and tell her. That's when I stopped, for about 5 months, and I want to describe those months honestly, because they were not dramatic, and that is the point. I moved back to Bristol, into a rented room in a house with 3 other adults, at 48, because I no longer had a flat and had no deposit for one. I had savings of about £2,000. I had a 4-year hole in my employment history, and a reference from a job I'd left in 2020. And what I mostly did was sleep. That was the strangest part. After 3 years of 2 or 3 hours a night, my body simply took the sleep back, 12, 13 hours at a stretch, for weeks. I would wake at 2 in the afternoon in a rented room and not be able to account for the day. Grief did not arrive properly until about month 3, because grief needs space, and I had not had any. And when it came mixed with the other thing. The two were completely inseparable. I could not mourn my mother without also thinking about what she'd been told about me, and I could not think about what she'd been told without wanting to ring her and explain which is the specific insanity of this kind of loss. The person I most needed to talk to about the accusation was the person the accusation had been made to. I drafted letters to her. That's the thing I have not told many people. 4 or 5 times in that period, I sat down and wrote to my dead mother, explaining the car, explaining the wet room, explaining the £380 a month. setting out my defense to a woman who had been dead for 6 months. I did not send them, obviously. There was nowhere to send them. But I wrote them, and I think anyone who has been accused of something after the death of the only person whose opinion mattered will understand exactly why. And I stopped fighting, not because I decided to. It simply drained out of me. I had won the audit, comprehensively, expensively, unambiguously, and it had achieved nothing, and I could not construct any theory of what winning would even look like. There was no money left to recover. There was no apology available. There was no way to reach the one person the lie had been told to. That is the honest bottom of this story. Not a dramatic collapse, but a woman of 48 asleep in the afternoon in a rented room in Bristol, having proved her innocence and found it worthless. 3 things ended it, and none of them were financial documents. The first was Fajumo. Fajumo Yusuf was one of the agency carers who came 3 mornings a week for the last 14 months. She was in that house 400-odd times. She came to my mother's funeral on her own day off, which I thought at the time was simply a kind thing. I rang her in the September, mostly because I wanted to talk to somebody who had been there. And within about 5 minutes, she said, "Can I say something?" I did not want to say at the funeral. And Fajumo Yusuf told me that on at least 3 occasions she had been in the house, in the kitchen, or in the hall, doing what carers do, which is being present without being counted as present, while my sister sat with my mother and talked about money. She remembered it specifically because she had found it distressing. She said my mother would become agitated, and that on one occasion she remembered the date approximately because it was near Ramadan. My mother had cried, and Yvette had comforted her and had said, and Fajumo was clear about this phrase, "I'm not saying she's taking it, Mom. I'm saying nobody knows. I'm not saying she's taking it. I'm saying nobody knows." And Fajumo said something that reframed the whole thing for me. She said, "In this work you see it. Not often, but you see it. There is always one who does the caring, and sometimes there is one who makes sure the caring never counts." I asked her whether she had recorded any of it, and she said, "And this is where a paid carer's professionalism saved my life, of course. I write in the daily notes. If the client is distressed, I write what happened and why. That is the job. The daily notes. Agency care notes, written contemporaneously in the house in a folder that stayed with the client 3 mornings a week for 14 months. I had that folder. It was in a box in my mother's house with the rest of the metal stuff. I had never read it, because why would you read your own mother's care notes when you were there for all of it? I read the whole thing in one sitting, on the floor of a storage unit in Luton, and I found 4 entries. One of them, from the March of the last year, said, "Client tearful this morning. Says she's worried about money and does not know what is happening with her account. Reassured. Client said her daughter Yvette has been asking her questions and it upsets her. Client asked me not to mention it to Geraldine. Advised client to speak to family. Will monitor." Client asked me not to mention it to Geraldine. The second was the GP, because that entry said, "Will monitor," and agency carers who monitor things escalate them. And in my mother's medical records, which, as her personal representative, I was entitled to request, there was a GP note from 6 weeks later. It recorded a home visit, and under the section on mood and anxiety it said, "Low mood, anxious re financial affairs. States family disagreement about management of her money is making her ill, reluctant to discuss further. Daughter G present in house but not in room at PT's request. At the patient's request." My mother had asked the GP to speak to her without me in the room, and had told him that a family disagreement about her money was making her ill. Not that I was stealing. That the disagreement was making her ill. Which is a very different thing, and which I only understood the significance of when I got to the third thing. The third was the notebook. My mother lost her handwriting in year 3, but before that, through 2021 and into 2022, she wrote. Not a diary exactly. She had an A5 notebook by her chair in which she wrote lists, reminders, things she wanted to say when she could no longer say them, in handwriting that got worse across 60 pages and then stopped. I had kept it, obviously. I had not been able to read it. It sat in a drawer in Bristol for 11 months before I could open it. I want to describe reading it, because it was not the triumphant discovery it sounds like. I opened it on a Sunday afternoon in October, in a rented room, and the first thing that happened is that I saw her handwriting and had to stop for about 20 minutes. Her handwriting was the thing I had watched deteriorate. I had watched that hand lose its grip across 2 years, and here it was, 60 pages of it, going from her ordinary confident script at the front to something almost unreadable at the back. You can watch the disease happen in that notebook. Page 1 is a woman making a shopping list. Page 58 is someone trying, and most of it is nothing. That's the thing nobody tells you about the documents that save you. It is not a diary of her inner life. Sainsbury's, bin day Thursday, ring-a-lane, ask G about the blue folder. Page after page of a dying woman's admin. I read 40 pages of shopping lists looking for my own name and finding it only in things like G doing chemist. And then on a right-hand page, under a list that ended with kitchen roll, in handwriting that was already beginning to go, there were 9 lines about me. I read them and I did not feel relieved. I want to be accurate about this. What I felt first was a kind of terrible tenderness, because what those 9 lines actually record is my mother, dying unable to walk, being worked on by one daughter and washed by the other, sitting in a chair deciding alone. She would carry it herself, rather than injure either of us. She solved it the way she solved everything her whole life, which was by absorbing it and saying nothing. Relief came later, hours later, when I read it for about the 9th time and the actual sentence landed. I know what is happening. I understand her. But the first thing was grief, because I understood that she had been managing my sister and protecting me. In the last year she could hold a pen, and had never once let me carry any of it. And on a page in the middle, in wavering handwriting, under a shopping list my mother had written, Why again about the money? She means well, I think, but I do not like it. G does everything. G is the one who is here. I have watched her clean me, and she does not flinch. Y says nobody knows what is happening. I know what is happening. G shows me the bank on the computer, and I do not understand it, but I understand her. If I say I am not worried, Y will think I am confused. If I say I am worried, it is not fair on G, so I say nothing to either of them. I wish I could ask C, but he's gone. I know what is happening. I understand her, so I say nothing to either of them. My mother, sitting in a chair with a terminal diagnosis, being worked on by one daughter and cared for by another, had assessed it correctly. She had known that Yvette meant well and was wrong. She had known what I was doing and had watched me clean her and had written down that I did not flinch. And she had said nothing to either of us for the rest of her life because she could not find a way to say it that did not injure one of her daughters. She spent the end of her life managing us. That is what she did with the time she had left, and I never knew, and I could have told her, and she could have simply asked me, and neither of us did. There was no court. There was nothing to sue anybody for. I had already been cleared, and Yvette had never made a formal allegation, and you cannot sue someone for asking questions. What there was instead was a Sunday in November at my Aunt Beryl's house, with Marcus, Yvette, Beryl, and 2 cousins, at which I read 3 things out loud. I read Fajumo's care note. Client asked me not to mention it to Geraldine. I read the GP's note. States family disagreement about management of her money is making her ill, and I read my mother's notebook. I had rehearsed the last one for a week, and I still could not get through it. Beryl finished it for me. She read the last part in a room where nobody was moving, and when she got to if I say I am worried it is not fair on G, so I say nothing to either of them, my cousin Elaine put her hand over her mouth. And Yvette said, and I will give her this, it was the only honest thing she said in 3 years, she said. I didn't know she cried. And Beryl said, Yvette, she wrote that in 2021. You did it for 2 more years after that. Marcus said nothing at all. He has since apologized to me twice, both times by text, both times briefly, and I have accepted it because he was 4 years away and was genuinely told a story. Because he is the only one of the 3 of us who has said the words, I got it wrong. I want to say one more thing about that afternoon at Beryl's, because the reckoning did not feel like winning, and I think it is important to say so. I had imagined, in the months of preparing it, that reading those 3 documents aloud would give me something. Vindication or release, or at least the satisfaction of watching my sister's face when the notebook was read. And I got none of that. Yvette's face, when Beryl read the last lines, did not crumple in the way I had pictured for months. It went blank, defended. She said the one true thing. I didn't know she cried. And then she reassembled herself, and by the end of the afternoon she had already begun constructing the version she lives in now, which is that grief has made me cruel. And I sat in Beryl's front room having finally proved, to a room of witnesses, every single thing I had been carrying alone for a year, and I felt no better. Because the only verdict I actually wanted was my mother's, and she had already given it in a notebook in 2021, and there was no way to add anything to it. I could not make it more true by reading it to Yvette. It was already completely true. My mother had known. Reading it aloud did not increase how much she'd known. That is the thing about being vindicated after a death. The audience you want is not in the room and never will be. Everybody else's belief is, in the end, almost irrelevant, a formality. The person whose belief mattered had settled the question privately, 2 years before she died, and taken her verdict with her, and left me a copy. I do not speak to my sister. There was no dramatic rupture. It simply became apparent over about a year that there was nothing to say. She has never apologized. Her position, as relayed to me by cousins, is that she asked reasonable questions, that the audit proved everything was fine, and that I have made it in something enormous because of the grief. She may even believe that. I have come to think she probably does, because the alternative, that a woman's small campaign to be the important daughter made her dying mother cry, is not a thing a person can hold about themselves. The estate was divided equally, as our mothers will said. I did not contest it and had no wish to. I did claim and receive reimbursement of the £4,500 I spent on the audit, which Yvette resisted and which Marcus, to his credit, insisted on. I went back to work eventually. Different field, lower grade, a 4-year hole in my CV that I have stopped apologizing for in interviews. I sold my mother's house eventually. My third of it, it was divided and sold, and the proceeds split. I took my share and did not argue about a penny of it because arguing about money was the one thing I could not do without becoming in my own eyes the person I had been accused of being. I have been careful with money to the point of absurdity ever since. I keep receipts for things I buy for other people. I once lent a friend £40 and wrote it in a notebook, and then sat looking at the notebook and understood exactly why I had done it and had to put it away. That is a thing this does to you that also does not audit. I am now a person who documents, who keeps proof, who cannot do anyone a financial kindness without creating a paper trail, because some part of me has learned that a kindness with no paper trail is a weapon someone can pick up later. I do not think I will ever fully lose that, and I resent it, because it is the exact opposite of the way my mother lived, and the way she raised me, which was to help people and not count it. She helped people her whole life and never count it, and it is the reason there was no document, and the reason there was no document is the reason my sister could do what she did. So the lesson the world has tried to teach me from all this is, count everything. And I have learned it, and I hate that I have learned it, because the woman who didn't count things is the woman I am grieving. And I got 2 years of counseling, which I mentioned because it was necessary, and because nobody in these stories ever says so. What I needed help with was not the injustice. It was a single specific thought that I could not get out from under for about 18 months, which was, she was frightened of me, and I was cheerful at her, and I never noticed. That's the thing that doesn't audit. I was in that house for 4 years being briskly, deliberately cheerful. Because that's what you do. You keep the atmosphere light for a dying person. And some part of her was frightened, and my cheerfulness must have looked, at times, like a person getting away with something. The notebook is what saved me from that in the end, because she wrote I understand her. She wrote I know what is happening. She was not frightened of me. She was frightened of the situation, of not being able to check, of being asked questions she couldn't answer, of 2 daughters she couldn't reconcile. That distinction is the whole difference between a survivable grief and an unsurvivable one, and I got it from 60 pages of failing handwriting in an A5 notebook that sat in a drawer for 11 months. Fajumo and I still speak. She said something on the phone once that I've kept when I thanked her for the care notes. She said, "We write everything down because we are strangers in your house. Nobody believes a stranger. So we write it down, and then it is not the stranger saying it, it is the record. Then it is not the stranger saying it, it is the record. Here's the last thing. The reason this worked, the reason a thing this destructive could be done with no lie, no accusation, and nothing that could ever be pinned on anybody, is that my sister understood something I did not. You do not need to accuse someone of theft. You only need to introduce the question of theft to a person who cannot check. That is the whole method. An accusation can be answered, disproved, and repudiated. Question asked repeatedly, sympathetically, of someone who is bedbound and has no access to their own accounts and no ability to speak, cannot be answered at all. It just sits there in the room in the person, indefinitely. And the audit, when it finally came, proved the thing that was never actually alleged, and left the thing that was actually done completely untouched. My mother died on the 18th of January at 20 past 4 in the morning, holding my hand, after 4 years in which I did everything, and my sister asked questions. And what I got out of all of it, and it is more than I expected and less than I wanted, is 1 page of bad handwriting in which my mother, who could no longer speak, wrote down that she knew. G is the one who is here. I have watched her clean me and she does not flinch. She never said it to me. She couldn't work out how. But she wrote it down in 2021 in a notebook by her chair in case somebody ever needed to know. Somebody did.